Colleagues, let's restart our work because we still have two issues to be discussed, and we have also some guests to present the studies. First is the study on strengthening the security of supply of products containing critical raw materials for the green transition and decarbonization. I would like to welcome Madame Marie Lemuel from Bruegel and Mr. Elmer Rietveld from TNO for being with us today in order to present the study on the critical raw materials. This study assesses the needs and vulnerabilities of EU in accessing products containing critical raw materials needed for the green and digital transition especially, but not only. It also provides an overview on the wider situation to identify at which stage of the supply chain, ranging from raw materials to final products, the European industrial ecosystem is dependent on CRM, critical raw materials imports. We have a short time for this as we needed to accommodate Minister Galushenko earlier in our ITRE committee, but clearly we have time in order to listen to you and to understand what were your findings in this study. By saying that, reminding you kindly that you have 10 minutes for the presentation, then we have 4 colleagues eager to take the floor, at least 4 that are also involved in the discussions, also legislative work on critical raw materials, and then of course you have the time to respond to these questions. I kindly ask Madame Marie Lemuel to start, and of course you'll decide how you allocate the 10 minutes to present the study. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity to present our study. So I'm going to start with a few slides on... There we go. Just setting the scene about what are really the supply issues around raw materials, because in the discussion there seems to be 2 problems that are often conflated with each other, but that it's useful to separate. So to think about it, there's a bit of a static problem depending on the current industrial makeup of European economy, and a more dynamic problem. So in terms of static, it's really related to, if we observe the current dependencies and the current imports of raw materials that come into the European Union, there are some specific elements in the list of critical raw materials where we notice that Europe has a dependency on single importers or importers that account for more than 65% of imports. And so on the slide, I've just named a few. Many of them come from China, but not all. And we also notice that there are certain elements for which Europe has a large import dependency on friendly countries. So I've named 2 examples from Turkey and from the United States. But to put things into context, so we've talked a lot about energy. So the imports into the European Union of Russian fossil fuels in 2021, so even before the energy crisis, amounted to 120 billion euros, whereas the amounts that we're talking about in value for raw materials, they range from about 4 billion euros for something like palladium, all the way down to 4 million euros for an element like strontium. So when we're discussing whether Europe risks creating a dependency on raw materials in the same way that it created a dependency on Russian fossil fuels, the orders of magnitude are quite different, and this has to do with the fact that raw materials are the first step in supply chains. And so this brings us to the second element in the more dynamic interpretation, where we think of all the industries that are going to be necessary for clean tech goods and renewable energy, where Europe is going to need a lot more raw materials. So I have a few numbers. These are really the short list of elements where the predicted growth in demand far outstrips the historical growth in demand. And these are elements where we might have some supply problems. And really, there's a dual challenge. So there's the question of bringing investment that will produce more quantity of these goods, irrespective of where this takes place. So this is bringing global production up to meet demand, but there's then also a fragmentation challenge that relates to exactly where these elements are mined, but more importantly, where they are refined. And looking at our study, in our analysis, we find that actually China controls certain bottlenecks, especially around the refining and processing stage of raw materials. And before I pass the floor to my colleague, Elmar Rietveld, just to mention that, again, raw materials need to be understood in a whole supply chain perspective where they come into the production of intermediate goods and final products. And I've just put 3 examples on the slides of important goods relevant for the green transition, where actually we observe that Europe imports the finished goods or even the intermediate materials more than the raw elements themselves that go into the manufacturing.
Thank you. And moving on towards the key findings, I would like to ask you 2 maybe straightforward questions. Just looking at these pictures, which one would you rather have in stock, on shelf, as a company or as an EU? Is it the ores on the left or the products, in this case a permanent magnet synchronized motor, on the right? Ores extracted, a raw material on the left, or a product containing these critical raw materials. Which one do you like best? And then the other question would be, this the Kiruna district was in the news. Imagine this part of Sweden producing all the the rare earth elements that we need today, in 5 years' time, 10 years' time. Then the question, where would these extracted minerals go in the current situation? And in this case, I can give you the answer. 90% of it would go to China, because that's where they are refined, and maybe a small 10% would go to Australia. And in Europe, we have Silmet, in Estonia, and in France, small locations. But this underscores the point that Marie already made about the raw materials being part of an entire chain and needs to be refined, and further on in the supply chain being used in components, etc. So the key findings, 5 of them. The first one is the point that we already made, that EU has a dependency on imports of key components for the technologies that we need for transitions, rather than the raw materials themselves. That is the situation as it is. That's what we found analyzing the imports of the EU as a block. And that has implications for the composition of any stockpile. Again, what do you put in the stockpile? Is it the raw materials, or is it the around the 300 products that we found? And actually they are in the annex of our report, in case you want, but you can think of not only metal products, but also turbine blades, electromotors, what have you, semiconductors. Second point is the outcomes of the EU critical raw material assessments. They are robust. We did an independent assessment ourselves, and we found that the outcomes were robust, and that's a good thing. And of course, I will not dwell on the difference between critical raw materials and strategic raw materials. There's a slight difference, but so meaning we know what the raw materials are important to us, but do we know to the same level which products, which components are so vital for EU industry? The third key finding are numbers about the stockpile themselves. Assuming our proposed composition of product groups, the product groups that we import from non-EU countries, and assuming 2021 prices, we find the value for 60 days, and 60 days as a period is based on experiences from other non-EU countries, Switzerland, Japan, etc. And we find a value of 25 billion euros. And remember that out of this 25 billion euros, only 10% is the value of critical raw material ore. So 90% is in the value of these products that we import from outside the EU. The fourth key finding is any investment in stockpiling should therefore be mirrored by another investment in the EU industrial ecosystem. This ecosystem it needs to be competitive in open strategic autonomy. It should supply the world as we source from the global economy, at least most of it. And thinking about a 40% percentage that is now part of the CRM Act, 40% of the strategic raw material consumption of the EU should be sourced in 2030 in the EU. Well, that's a good start. But please think about the next steps in those supply chains, in those value chains, and those next steps in the EU industrial system. Be it permanent magnets, metal products, machinery parts, vehicles, what have you. And the final key finding is to beef up the stockpile of products in the EU, to increase the size of the stock. We find that stakeholder interaction shows that the private sector is inclined to take up this challenge rather than a specially designated public body. So professionals from wholesale and procurement can pick up this 25 billion challenge. And then the last visual reminder of our message before we get to the questions. To coin a phrase, give the EU industry a stockpile and feed it for 60 days. But work towards strategic autonomy, you can feed it for a lifetime. And this visual from the report shows that you can think of a stockpile as being a solution that addresses problems that arise in terms of days or weeks. So that's the left side of this visual, days. And I don't read the fine print, read the report maybe. But stockpiles can solve problems that are relevant on the time scale of days and weeks. But please do not forget that we also have challenges on time scale of many years. And that's where the commensurate investment in your ecosystem comes in. Make sure that it's not just focused on raw materials, but the refined materials, the metal products, and everything down the chain, all the way towards the products that we actually need for our societal, so very vital societal transitions. So maybe to round up, this is the study. It's to strengthen the security of supply of products containing critical raw materials. And now maybe you find why the title is so long. Products containing critical raw materials. It's a good study. We invite you either to read it or to have it on the shelf as a reference because it's very rich in information. And we're happy to take questions and answers, to give answers.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for the study and also for respecting the time. And clearly, most of the findings we anticipated a little bit, but it's good that they are more clear now after the study. And of course, I'm sure that colleagues will have questions. And I start with Mrs. Bentele from EPP.
Ja, ich möchte mich auch ganz.
I'd like to say thank you for the study. It was very helpful, I have to say. I'm happy that one of the key findings is that we have a robust methodology, so congratulations to the Commission. They're working with good methods. That's very good to have that confirmed. I liked the fact that they're thinking forward. And about replacing critical inputs, critical raw materials. That's important. Thinking of legislation. So thank you for that too. 2 years ago, I was the rapporteur for the Parliament report on raw materials, and I was very cautious when it came to stockpiling, because it's expensive, it's difficult to calculate. I see the reference to 6 dates, but it's a very 60 days. It's a very slim period. In Germany, we've said it should be done by companies. That's what they found. And it's good to have find that out because member states have different ideas on that. But what I'd be interested in is to see this in terms of legislation and the benchmarks suggested there, 10% domestic production, and then the 65% diversification and the 15% recycling. I won't mention recycling, but 65% diversification for all critical raw materials would interest me. Perhaps that should be seen differently for different raw materials. Perhaps you have some guidance on that. I've forgotten the 40% further processing. That's a critical factor which you confirmed. I think that's a very high goal. You showed us LKAB working with rare earths. So what about further processing? We're more dependent there than with mining. I'd be interested your ideas about the figures that we have in legislation apart from recycling.
Thank you so much. Mr. Nica, please.
Mulțumesc, domnule președinte.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for the study, and thank you for saying a number of things that we feel are important, especially during this post-naive period that we are going through right now. Maybe a few years ago, this study would not have been welcomed, or maybe it would have been considered blasphemy. What do you mean? We're supposed to be using rare earths in the EU? Or we're supposed to be mining them in the EU? No, we're supposed to be buying them abroad. There are a number of things that I'd like to say. First of all, the fact that there are that there are CRMs in the EU is clear. Maybe I didn't read the study very well, but where are they, and what is the share of such materials that we own? I'm from Romania. In Romania, we have borate, phosphorus, quartz, 99.9% silicon. Then we have tellers, selenium, titanium, wolfram. And what else do we have? Graphite, cobalt, lithium, graphite, cobalt, lithium, and some of the largest magnesium stocks that we have. And how much are we mining right now? 0. So we're talking about more autonomy. You said that in Sweden, the greatest reserves that we've ever found were discovered lately. But what are the decisions that we're supposed to be making? Because we are decision makers. What decisions should we make tomorrow in order to reduce our dependence that you mentioned? 85%, 95% when we're talking about the components for solar panels and batteries. But if we only want to import manufactured goods, obviously we will be very dependent on what other countries are selling, although some countries are not very reliable at all. And then you also talked about processing. Where should processing take place and how? And if you can give us names, it would be very good. What are the member states that are known and have such certified reserves? And how high are these reserves? Then you probably have recommendations too. What is your recommendation? We are working on a file which will probably be attributed tomorrow, so it's a legislative file. I'm sure you've seen the Commission's proposal. What are the 3 things that you don't like or that should be improved in that proposal? Because you've done a study, it's 124 pages. What are the 3 things that you would do or you would propose if you were a decision maker in order to improve the Commission's proposal concretely? Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Nica.
Mr. Dalunde. Mrs. Han, please.
Yes, thank you very much for this very interesting presentation and the study that I have read with great interest. It's a very valuable input, and I'm really looking forward to our common work on critical raw materials in the future. And first of all, just let me correct the position, Hildegard. Eventually, you were just citing the German position on stockpiling. As far as I know, Germany and France is supporting stockpiling, so we have to go in that discussion a little further in the future. However, I think the study, as we have seen, thank you very much for that, focuses largely on stockpiling as a course of action to mitigate supply disruptions of raw materials and components, and it investigates the suitability of stockpiling as a solution to alleviate the consequences of supply chain disruptions and of the potential weaponization of trade vulnerabilities, especially in the specific context of achieving the green transition. And of course, as we know, stockpiling of strategic inputs for our society is common in the EU, especially when it comes to oil stocks. And however, such an approach is not common here for other types of materials, such as so-called strategic raw materials. And in your view, what would be the most effective and efficient way in terms of cost for society in particular, but also in terms of ability to react quickly to implement a public policy for strategic stockpiling of raw materials? So I'm grateful if we go a little more in the details here on this occasion again. And should it be directly managed by the states or other public authorities, or should it rather be imposed to companies? Because, of course, the correlating problem or challenge is that it's on the shoulder of taxpayers, right? And companies in general, they know what they're doing. So we have an expertise there as well. So it's a very interesting topic we could explore further. Then bearing in mind that part of the issues faced by companies with their supply chain is due to the just-in-time approach, instead of adopting a more cautious stance, such as with the just-in-case approach, where companies are creating stocks for their own resilience. Or would you believe that an active stockpiling approach could create a risk of moral hazard? So that's an interesting discussion, I think. And you recall the examples from the US, Japan, South Korea, and Switzerland. And I would be interested, why did it work so well in these countries, in your opinion? And according to your assumption, a potential stockpile could cover 60 days of imports. Estimates of the possible value of CRM's stockpile range between 6.45 billion and 25.8 billion when we refer to prices 2021. And as a short question again, so we know how crucial it is to prioritize circularity and recycling over primary raw materials extraction, and the vital role of circularity for our long-term competitiveness. So in your view, what's the potential of circularity, and what time frame to limit the need of stockpiling on the long run, if you are in favor of that? And also, as you rightly point out, the poorly timed stockpiling activities could contribute to market destabilization by exacerbating shortages and damaging relations with third countries. So if you say a little more about that aspect as well, I would be grateful. Thanks.
Thank you. I invite Mr. Tobisowski to take the floor.
Thank you very much. I will speak Polish. Szanowni Państwo.
Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Chairman, thank you for this study, and thank you for raising this topic in our agenda. This study is a good departure point, and in order to develop stockpiles, we could stockpile these raw materials. This is an interesting proposal, but the question arises whether stockpiling is sufficient in order to achieve all the goals related to environment and climate. And now some figures. Let's take into account the global political context. What I mean is the countries that you mention in the report, the countries on which EU is dependent. This is China, Russia, China, that is purchasing and getting materials from Africa. These are very important components from the point of view of our green transition. And by 2030, the power of onshore wind farms must be increased from 180 gigawatts to 369 gigawatts, so it has to be doubled. And onshore, this must also be increased by 5 times. And the Wind Europe organization estimates that in 23 until 27, we will have another 98 gigawatts of power installed. However, based on the data of the International Energy Agency, in order to produce a wind turbine of 1 megawatt, we need more than 15 tons. This is about onshore wind farms. We need 10 tons, 15 tons on the sea and 15 tons on land. So we need around 50 tons of raw materials. So this is a lot of materials. And hence my question, the stockpiling proposal is interesting, but is this scale sufficient? And I have a question, where to source these materials in order to have supply security and also at the same time achieve our climate goals. And we have to realize in Europe that we also are going away from mining, from extraction industry. We are lacking know-how in Europe, and in countries from which we source these materials, there is a violation of human rights, there is child labor, and this is also a great challenge. This is also our responsibility. This is related to our accountability for a new climate program. Thank you.
Potenga, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Merci aux auteurs du rapport.
Thanks very much, Chairman. Thank you for this report. There have been a lot of questions asked by colleagues. I don't want to repeat what's already been said by them, but I think that looking at the report and looking at the question of dependency, it's, I think, important that in the EU we stick to a diversification in our trade relations perspective and don't give in to the temptation, which is happening at the moment, to move to a position of confrontation with people who are actually strategically important when it comes to our access to certain CRMs and other strategic resources. Because when you look at the question of dependence, the risk is very high, and we're not going to offset that in the next 3 months or even longer. At the same time, there was a study carried out by industry a year ago that listed a series of other materials, particularly aluminium, copper, nickel, cobalt as well, and they stressed the limits of the European approach. The Commission spoke last year about having 80% independence when it came to lithium by 2025. So that's my first question. According to your figures, according to the work that you've done, which is obviously quite searching, is it realistic to aim for 80% lithium by 2025? Does that fit in with the research that you've carried out? A second question on reserves. It's already been asked by 2 or 3 other colleagues. Obviously, up till now, the industry hasn't done anything. Obviously, putting it into the public domain would create a potential risk, a big risk for taxpayers. But otherwise, what do we do? How can we encourage or force industry to do it? Since they haven't done it up to now, we'll be paying for them to do it. So the risk would remain with the taxpayers, whereas at the end of the day, the industry would reap all the profit. So how do you see that? What kind of thing can we do? Because if we've got these things carried out ostensibly by industry, but basically at public expense. Thank you.
Beaucoup, Monsieur Botenga. Bon, vous avez écouté les questions, les suggestions.
Well, you listened to those questions and suggestions, quite a lot of questions, so please, if you could answer them and draw some kind of final conclusion. It's up to you to decide who starts, etc.
Peut-être la même ordre, Madame Le Muet.
Perhaps you can go first, Madame Lemoyle. Have the same order as before.
Okay.
Yes, thank you very much for all the questions. I'm going to take some of them and leave most of the stockpiling discussion to my colleague. So you had two very concrete questions that were raised. What is our opinion on the targets in the Critical Raw Materials Act? And more generally, does it go in the right direction, and what you should focus on? And my answer to that is really at the end of the day, the question that you want to ask is, where does Europe want to position itself in the value chains? Because mining and refining are not particularly high value-added activities. And so it goes in the direction of what you were saying about how your country has many reserves, but very little mining activity, because these are not necessarily activities that bring value. So these are choices that have been come out of market forces, and to what extent you want to steer those away. So I would say in terms of the targets, the 65% from a single country could be used as a useful benchmark to kind of understand the situation, and the information I provided in the slide kind of flags particular country product combinations where we might want to pay more attention. But I also deliberately flagged that there are some friendly countries, or also, for example, there's a hafnium where all the supply comes from France. It's above 65%, but do we really think it's a problem? So that might be a useful threshold, but not necessarily something that should be legally binding. And then in terms of the production, so the mining 10% and the refining 40%, it really goes into this discussion of how much value added do we want to create in Europe. And the point I was trying to make in trying to bringing all of the supply chain into perspective is we might want to focus on much more high value added activities. And it means that we probably want to diversify supply, but of intermediate products. And ensure that the producers of these intermediate products themselves have access to diverse supply of critical raw materials, but that production can happen wherever the supplies are located. So if we take, for example, the examples of lithium and cobalt for EVs, batteries, the reserves of lithium are in essentially Chile and Australia, but then it goes to China for refining. So we might want to think in terms of that diversification. And so in terms of what is the Critical Raw Materials Act missing is really this international dimension and thinking much more globally about where production happens. And it's actually very light on pushing investment outside of the European Union to bring all of these materials into the market, and to kind of go in the direction about the aluminum, copper, and nickel. Eventually, in an ideal scenario, we would want the lithium and the cobalt markets to look like those markets, like big commodity markets where there are many producers online and there are large quantities being traded, where if supply from one country falls into a blip for natural or political reasons, there are alternatives.
Thank you. Where should mining take place? Well, at least we have good data where that is. It can be Finland, Sweden, Poland, Portugal. So domestic mining is an option, especially when it replaces fossil fuel extraction. Recycling is very important, but especially in a time scale of 10 years, 15 years, it's unlikely to contribute significantly. So we should improve our recycling operations, but in terms of metal requirements, do not expect too much. Order of magnitude 5 or 10, 15%. That is already quite something if recycling could ever, on a time scale of within 20 years, could deliver that. The moral hazard or the tax burden side of it, if you pay for additional stock operationalized by the private sector, I would say the one thing that the public has is the right to determine where this stock will go in terms of in times of emergency. When there's stock draw, we need the stock. Where does it go? Well, the public can decide because the public has financed this. So that's maybe one way to fight moral hazard and to make up for the tax burden that you place on the public. The three things I would improve in the current legislation, the CRM Act and maybe also the Net Zero Industrial Act. One is, please be more clear about the system boundary, the scope. Is it anything towards just refined metal? We need much more in the chain than just raw materials or refined metals. One. Two, be forward-looking in terms of ICT deployment, digital product passports, also to fight or to ensure due diligence, to fight child labor, for instance, to calculate carbon footprints. So the second improvement, be more clear-eyed on the ICT options in the near future. And the third one would be, and it's not my field of expertise, but if you are investing strategic projects on the long term, 10, 20 years, maybe about third countries be more explicit about which countries you would consider. But there is also already quite a list of countries named there. So I hope I addressed some questions that were raised, and maybe also looking at the time, we'll leave it there. And of course, happy to answer questions later on.
Thank you so much. Clearly, it is a big issue, it's a big discussion. As Mr. Nica mentioned, we have now in front of us also a legislative work. We'll need to allocate also, we'll have other opportunities to discuss. We'll have a rapporteur, a team. We already did it, and Mrs. Bentele was responsible in the past for our own initiative report. So clearly, your study will be extremely useful, and I encourage the colleagues that are here or are represented or are listening via the internet, web streamed, to contact you directly if there is something that they would like to know, or if they would need some other informations about the study. And so once again, thank you for the study, and thank you for being here to present and also to answer to the questions. Thank you so much. Colleagues, the last point on the agenda will be another study, which is the study on the revision of the third energy package for gas. I would like to thank Mr. Yuri Dishkov from research consultancy EPRS for being with us today to present this study. Once again, the study is the revision of the third energy package for gas. The study aims to provide an overview of the proposed package for a revised gas framework, also in light of the current energy crisis and the new geopolitical context due to Russian invasion of Ukraine. You know well, dear colleagues, that the European Parliament, thanks to the work of its two co-rapporteurs, actually rapporteurs, because you have two legislative files, but they are of course connected, complementary. I'm talking about Mr. Buzek, President Buzek, and Mr. Geier, and their shadows already has a negotiating position for a package and is looking forward to soon starting interinstitutional negotiations. But also preparing these interinstitutional negotiations and looking to the broad context, what EPRS has done, and the presentation of the study will be extremely relevant. That's why I kindly invite Mr. Dishkov to present the study, of course, to do it in the 10 minutes allocated time. And then we have two colleagues, maybe they will come back. If not, of course, it will be open for colleagues to look at it and maybe come back for questions and comments. But now I kindly invite you to present the study, and I see there is also a PowerPoint presentation. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you so much for the introduction and giving the opportunity to present our study's findings. Let me just get to the first slide. So as you mentioned already, our study is merely an overview of the proposed revision of the third energy package for gas. Specifically, we've been looking into the impact of the unbundling, the proposed unbundling rules on both gas and hydrogen networks. Also on the development of a hydrogen infrastructure, and particularly we looked at the EU Hydrogen Backbone Initiative, and finally on ensuring how the developments on how to ensure energy supply through gas infrastructure, and I'll give a note on the policy recommendations that followed from our study. So firstly, the EU hydrogen and decarbonized gas market package, it provides a first step in the regulatory framework to enable decarbonized and renewable gas to enter the European market, which works further towards decarbonizing the European gas market, improving security of supply, and also enhancing volatility against gas market price. This is proposed through the revision of the third energy package for gas. One thing to keep in mind is that this third package, implemented in 2009, was not as such designed or aimed. Its aim was not to design new infrastructure, gas infrastructure, but merely to regulate the existing networks. This is different from the current hydrogen market, as the hydrogen market is still developing. It's in a nascent state at the moment. And this creates uncertainties and risks, which is also reducing the incentive for gas undertaking stakeholders to make capital intensive investments. This is particularly being raised also by stakeholders, as the proposal proposes a cutoff date of the 31st of December of 2030, where certain exemptions on third-party access, tariff structures, and also these unbundling rules are being cancelled. And stakeholders are particularly concerned that gas transmission operators, which are using the ITO model, as you can see in the image here, they would be barred from investing in hydrogen, and therefore lack the incentive of doing so, which is highly necessary for setting up such a European hydrogen network. The European Commission has exposed a clear preference for implementing the ownership unbundling model. However, we do not find convincing evidence, or at least convincing evidence is very thin at best, for implementation of the ownership unbundling model on the gas market. Moreover, there is no convincing evidence that excluding the ITO model would actually benefit the hydrogen uptake and uptake of hydrogen infrastructure. But it is known that the exclusion of the ITO model will come with additional costs, especially for those transmission system operators that use this model, and thus it creates a burden. Therefore, we do consider regulatory alignment with the gas and electricity market to be preferential over this. Looking into the development of hydrogen infrastructure, the EU hydrogen backbone is a very ambitious initiative proposed by some gas TSOs and DSOs, system operators. As you can see in the image, it tends to link or create a network to link all hydrogen clusters. Even though the hydrogen infrastructure is likely going to be less dense as the current natural gas infrastructure, still additional investments are needed. According to this scenario of the European hydrogen backbone, by 2030, about 5 large-scale pipeline interconnectors in Europe can be employed, which will likely enable about half of the target of 10 million tons of hydrogen, as stated in the RePower EU proposal, to be placed, and this is likely to be doubled by 2040. Looking at the different options for deployment of hydrogen infrastructure, there are four main options. First and foremost is repurposing of current existing hydrogen infrastructure. Second is blending of hydrogen into existing and also new infrastructure. Thirdly, there's the option to construct new and dedicated hydrogen infrastructure. And finally, of course, it's possible to import hydrogen. I'd like to stress here especially the repurposing option. It is, as it's generally agreed, that this is the most cost-efficient option. This requires the existing operators. Also, the European Hydrogen Backbone Initiative assumes that more than half of what is necessary, infrastructure that's necessary, is being repurposed in infrastructure. Other key requirements to facilitate the uptake of hydrogen and hydrogen infrastructure. First and foremost, there's a lot of European and national funds supporting hydrogen and hydrogen infrastructure, but additionally, private financing is necessary. One of the main challenges the stakeholders have presented to us are the permitting processes that take quite some time, especially in drafting the infrastructure. One key element also in the uptake of hydrogen is the deployment of sufficient renewable energy. The current target for 2030 is 32% of renewable energy out of total energy consumption. And critics argue that this energy is better to be used directly in decarbonizing sectors rather than using it for creating hydrogen. And finally, as discussed before already shortly, security on the return on investments is a crucial element as well. As the development of the hydrogen market, both demand and supply, is highly uncertain. This poses risks and also uncertainty, which harms the uptake. Looking at developments regarding the energy supply, substantial progress has been made in increasing gas interconnectivity in Europe in the last couple of decades, but also in the last couple of months, as we can see also in this image. All the light green initiatives are initiatives that are planned or being employed as we speak. But still, some major infrastructure bottlenecks remain. For example, in West Europe, the bottleneck between Belgium, France, and Germany remains a critical one, and also the connection of the Iberian Peninsula, which has a large capacity for LNG imports, still is a major bottleneck to be transported to the rest of Europe. So additional investments in infrastructure are essential. Gas storage is a key component coming through winter, but also as providing system balance. The gas storage regulation has successfully led to minimum level of 80% last winter, and from this winter onwards will lead to a minimum level of 90%. It is more and more accepted that the European approach is more effective in dealing with uncertainties in global gas supplies, though one should be careful in drafting similar conclusions for the hydrogen market. As Acer reviews that from existing literature, there's no evidence that a consolidated European network of hydrogen is justified based on current demand, technology, and cost assumptions. Moving to the policy recommendations, on the short term, redirecting gas flows from Northwest Europe to Central and East Europe would need to secure the effective and efficient use of already highly utilized interconnectors. So it is advisable to encourage regional cooperation on immediate diversification efforts and demand aggregation. On the medium term, one should consider solving potential for stranded assets or uncertainties about stranded assets by ensuring all infrastructure will be made ready for hydrogen and hydrogen uptake through strategic planning. And on the long term, it's important to set the grounds for transition and to accelerate the uptake of hydrogen infrastructure. First, to assess and decide on which sectors are should be prioritized in receiving hydrogen, so that the scarce renewable energy available will be used for that, and the other renewable energy will be used for other sectors. And work on energy efficiency should be continued to reduce the demand for energy and therefore also for hydrogen. Thank you very much for your attention. These were our highlights of
Thank you so much. I have two interventions. First, Mr. González Casares, and then Mr. Bogovic.
Muchas gracias.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chairman. And thanks for all the work that you've carried out. It's reconfirmed Parliament's position on the gas package. As the study points out, we need to guarantee the supply of ever more decarbonised gas, which means more renewables and more hydrogen. Green hydrogen, of course, if we can get it. This idea of green gas has been part of the whole of this emergency with the question of security of supply. And the measures which have been taken have actually worked. We need to make certain that we have sufficient gas levels, but it did cost us a lot of money. So I'd like to ask about the differences in member states when it comes to unbundling. You've got the ITO model, which some people think improves the system. Those member states that have gone to more strict unbundling organisations, are they finding themselves in a disadvantaged situation, or is there now a framework for the question of decarbonised gas? And you spoke about bottlenecks, and we can use this perhaps as a blending can be a kind of transitional measure, but it will of course slow up the phasing out of fossil fuels or fossil fuel infrastructures, which could mean that we end up with stranded assets. How do you think this blending ought to go to make certain that these assets are not blocked and stranded? Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Mr. Bogovic, please.
Hvala za to študijo, ki...
Thank you for this study, which on the one hand opens up the basic dilemma that Europe has with the gas supply and the storage capacity, which we managed to fulfill last year, but also paid for this energy at a considerably high cost. And at the same time, this opens up the question of the future market. There were many expectations. A lot of energy has been invested into this new energy source. But at the same time, personally, I believe that there are many unknowns still to be answered. On the one hand, when it comes to the production itself in Europe, we set or laid down several bars of hydrogen. So how should it be produced from nuclear energy, green hydrogen, etc. So there are many colors to it. And then also the efficiency of the utilization of this energy that you convert. On the other hand, I know that the market is insecure as to where hydrogen should be used so that we could arrive to competitive industry and individual sectors. So I would like to know whether, when talking to those who are not deciding on a policy, but people who need to prepare financial models, have you come up with any findings as to how much interest is it? This 10 million tons that we set as our target for 2030, is it realistic? Do you have an impression that the economy, when it comes to the production of hydrogen and also when it comes to the consumption, will really see hydrogen as such an opportunity that these needs will grow? And will the economy really know how to produce products that will be profitable? This is why I am questioning, when it comes to the pipelines, whether we are not being too fast in our claims as to how we should repurpose the pipelines or how we should undergo blending, whereas the business models are not yet there, and also the cost benefit is not yet certain. Perhaps I am too ignorant really to know, but I will be happy to learn from you what are the market projections, so that we are sure that it will not only be funded by public money, but that it will really be a business model that will find the economic footing, and on the basis of which we will be able to guarantee our future.
Thank you. Please, Mr. Dishoff, if you would like to answer to these two interventions.
Of course. Thank you so much for the questions. Let me first start with the first question. You mentioned the differences between the use of the different models and whether that had any results in terms of uptake of decarbonized gases. What we've seen over the years is that the use of the models have been implemented differently around Europe. And what we've seen over the years is that increasingly the ownership unbundling model is being implemented. So more and more DSOs are implemented by ownership unbundling model. There's no direct link as far as our study results go to with the uptake of decarbonized gases as well. Second, on the use of blending, blending is particularly, as we've consulted from the stakeholders, blending is particularly relevant for the transnational interconnections, so that the flow of hydrogen is not being stopped at the border, and that's also supports the network of hydrogen and the uptake, and then the reuse of these fossil fuel infrastructures as part of the solution. Around the production of hydrogen and the uptake of it will definitely in the hard to abate sectors, so say aviation or shipping, international shipping. Hydrogen is a crucial component into decarbonizing these sectors and greening these sectors, and the uptake of green hydrogen is to be developed. It's a question. It's always a trade-off between market demand and supply and market developments. But for these market developments, infrastructure is necessary to be transported and to be brought to these end users. Currently, there are clusters which are producing hydrogen, grey hydrogen, black hydrogen themselves, and we'd like to change that to green hydrogen. So infrastructure developments are certainly necessary. And I think partly touched upon as well during the questions is something we should keep in mind, is that the gas or energy crisis is not over yet. We currently have these gas storages approximately being filled by 50-55% by starting of the implementation injection season. First injection already took place on 18th of March due to the warm weather, but there are a lot of uncertainties that determine our current the current winter, the current season, cold season, which also affects the security of supply. Okay. I hope I've been able to answer your questions. Otherwise, happy to.
I think you did.
Thank you so much.
Of course, hydrogen and hydrogen infrastructure and everything that you presented in the study, but also clearly what was linked to the questions of Mr. González Casares and Mr. Bogovic is a huge issue, and we will continue to discuss. The legislation is under negotiation, so we'll start trilogue soon. I'm very positive that it will have a conclusion during Spanish presidency, most probably because now we're just starting the negotiations, so until the end of the year. But even having this legislation in place, there are still a lot of other details that we need to rediscuss in order to really have a European genuine market on decarbonized gas and hydrogen, with everything that we need to do in order to boost the deployment of hydrogen. And once again, thank you for the study. The presentations are available. They were already sent to colleagues. I think the whole studies are also available or could be available from EPRS Secretariat. So thank you once again. Thank you for the study on the critical raw materials, and thank you for the study on the third energy package, and especially what is related to hydrogen. Many thanks to the interpreters, to the EPRS Secretariat, and to the services of European Parliament. With that, we are closing this afternoon session after a long afternoon with the Commissioner Kadri Simpson, the Energy Minister of Ukraine, and of course with very interesting two studies related to the core subjects on our agenda. Tomorrow, colleagues, we have Vice President Šefčovič on the gas purchase and other issues related to his work. And then, of course, we'll have Commissioner Thierry Breton, but also votes and the coordinators meeting. So see you tomorrow morning and have a nice evening. Bye-bye.